it's a difference between saying I can never know the answer to these questions and I can know the answer to these questions.
You're listening to Mobilizing Data for Justice, a podcast about how activists gather and make sense of data. This podcast is an edited interview with Giancarlo from Bellingcat. Giancarlo told us about how he does his work, why the work is important, and how he takes care of himself and others.
My interest in data came from, I would say, a recognition that I found really exciting going back to maybe 2009, 2010, like the early sort of Twitter age, that there were lots of videos and pictures that were coming out of conflict zones and that they were just online. Like people were wearing like GoPros and going into battles or recording, military operations. And then they were just uploading that on Facebook and on Twitter and sharing them on message boards. And none of that was making it to the big media organizations. Like if I wanted to know what was happening in Libya or Syria, I would go to a message board and like know more than the anchor at the BBC nightly news that night. And so that I remember like a specific kind of thread and in a message board that I used to frequent that I thought, wow, this is really crazy. Like I'm watching like frontline footage of combat in a place that I've never been to. I'm never going to go there. And the internet is full of this kind of stuff. But the news, which is supposed to be where you are getting your information from, I don't have to check that anymore. It's just like right here. Back then when I was just watching these videos and kind of keeping up to date with what other people were doing, not journalists, but people who were like analyzing the videos in their free time, I didn't think of that as investigative journalism. I was just sort of like still a consumer of information. But in 2014, I'm originally from Venezuela. And in 2014, there was a wave of protests that happened like right after President Chavez died and Maduro came in. The first wave of protests began. And at that time, I had a lot of free time. I had a weird job and I just had like tons of free time. And I knew I was kind of frustrated because there wasn't a lot of English news coverage about the protests. Like every single day, there was a massive protest in Venezuela. And then again, you'd watch CBC and it was like a 10-second like, and in Venezuela, there were more protests today. 30 people have been killed. And then in other news, the president of Mexico, right? Like it would just immediately switch. So at that moment, I thought, okay, I know that there's like, hours and hours and hours of footage and information that protesters are sharing every single day on social media. Hardly any of that is making it onto social media, onto the traditional news outlets. And so in early 2014, it's about February, I decided to start a website, just like a blog. And again, I had this weird job that had a lot of free time. And so I spent like every day for what eventually became several years, I would spend like an hour or two just on social media, on Venezuelan sort of circles on Twitter and Facebook and stuff, looking at what was happening in the country and then writing these English language summaries of what happened. Some of that involved, I recognize now, although I wasn't thinking about it at that time, it involved like journalism, like at least verifications, right? Like I was doing a kind of journalism, I suppose. So Bellingcat is an organization that started in 2014, and it was started by people who I think if you ask them these questions, they would tell you a similar story. They were like, yeah, 20, like the Arab Spring, I wanted to know what was going on in these countries. I wasn't getting anything from the news. And then I discovered that actually Twitter had like everything that you needed, right? So there was a group of people who made that also kind of realization at around the same time that I did. And then I'm talking about one person, Elliot Higgins, who's the founder of Bellingcat. He got some really, really early success with a blog that he started. So he started writing in like 2010 on chemical weapons use in Syria. Now, Elliot's not a journalist. He was a financial administrator somewhere. He was just like obsessed with these videos and he was able to, make important findings about chemical weapons use in Syria, like checking munition remnants and stuff. And like really quickly, people from the New York Times and big media organizations started noticing his work, and so he had like a kind of like a really exponential rise from like financial administrator who's doing this on the side because he thinks it's fun to suddenly, he's like writing for the New York Times. So in 2014, he launched this website. He said, okay, there's this thing that's happening. There's lots of information online. I want to have a place where people can publish, can do research on these topics, mostly conflict, using what we call open source information that's freely available online. And so he launched Bellingcat. I knew about Bellingcat because it launched in July of 2014, and I started my blog in February 2014. So I was aware of it because I remember thinking like, what Bellingcat is doing for Libya and Syria and Ukraine, I kind of want to do that for Venezuela. I remember having that thought really clearly. And so I never imagined I would, I was looking at what they were doing and I was like, that's like, those are the professionals, right? Like I play basketball in my driveway and I'm watching the NBA. Like those guys are the professional basketball players. I'm just like dribbling the ball and like trying to get better at, here. And so I never had any aspiration to work here. I never planned it. If somebody had told me like, hey, they're looking for researchers, I would not have applied. It was just not a thing that I thought this isn't, I'm going to go to grad school. I'm going to try to be a professor. It wasn't at all part of my plan. But I did have this blog that I kept running for many years. And in 2018, so 4 years after Bellingcat started, 4 years after I started my website, there was a really high profile event that happened in Venezuela. And I, by that time, had a bit of a following on Twitter. Like people knew me as like, oh, this is the Venezuela expert open source guy. And I remember that day, I stayed home I remember I was supposed to go to school actually, I stayed home. And I just like live tweeted this event that was happening. The Venezuelan police were raiding the home of a really high profile person. And the person was in the house and he was like recording the whole thing. So I was like translating what he was saying. And I had a really long like Twitter thread talking about this. So by the end of that day, this is January 2018, I got a message from somebody at Bellingcat. This is the first contact I'd had with them. And they said, hey, we're Bellingcat. I don't know if you know us. And I was like, yeah, of course I know you guys. And he said, okay, we're writing an article about this thing that happened. And we found your Twitter page, we found your website. We don't really know a lot about Venezuela. It'd be great if you could help us, and then we can, join forces. We'll do the open source, like, heavy lifting analysis and stuff. But it'd be great if you could like give us context and help us like write an article. And so in January 2018 is when I first got in contact with them, and then I started to help them with this article that we eventually got out. And so, after that, I just kind of stuck around until they offered me a job in December of 2018. And I said yes. And then, I've been here since. What makes Bellingcat interesting, and certainly what made it revolutionary when it launched, was that the people who were working there were very good at just being online and like navigating message boards, and they were basically like internet nerds. Like I say that as an internet, like these people who are like always on the internet, super skilled with just finding information and also sort of like critically analyzing it, right? So for example, with the early work on the Arab Spring, right? Like Elliot, he like recognized like actually you can use Google Earth because it has these satellite images that are updated quite frequently. If you have a video and you have a sense for when the video was taken, you can just go on Google Earth and you can look for features in the video and then you can find them on Google Earth, right? And so he was one of the first people I think who had that kind of like realization, and who said you can like almost like systematize this. You can make this into a methodology that you can get really good at, and then you'll never be caught off guard by another video, right? Like anytime a video comes out, you should be able to find, no matter where it was recorded, you should be able to like check where it was taken. And so that's what I mean by people who had like a facility with digital tools, people who were really used to being online, people who, were not afraid to experiment with new programs and new, types of software. I say that because I've come into contact since I've been here with a lot of journalists, like practicing journalists, and the skill sets are totally different, right? Like I've talked to journalists who are like excellent journalists and they're amazing at their job, but you sit them in front of a computer and they struggle to like even just like navigate Google Earth Pro, right? So that's what I mean by having like digital skills, like being really skilled with just like sitting at a computer and going like, okay, I'm going to figure this out. There's two kinds of people who are like at home in front of a computer and on the internet, people who like feel like they're not supposed to be there. The Bellingcat folks were the ones who were like, this is where I belong. Our relationship with tools has evolved over time because when we started, we had like no budget. Basically, everyone was pretty much a hobbyist. We were kind of doing this on the side. Most people had like full-time jobs. Like when I started working here, I was in year 4 of my PhD. And so we were just grabbing stuff that was already out there. So Google Earth Pro, anything that was free was like, we're going to use that. Now, over time, as we've gotten funding, we have money to afford tools. The biggest change I feel came in 2020, maybe 2019, 2020, when somebody gave us funding to buy an account with Planet. Planet is a commercial satellite image provider. And so before we got Planet, we had to wait for Google to release satellite images on Google Earth Pro. And they do that whenever they want. It could be once a month, it could be once a year. And so there were tons of projects that we just couldn't work because we would say, let's check Google. There's nothing there. Okay, shoot. Never mind that, right? But Planet gave us access to daily satellite imagery from everywhere on the planet. And we can also task images like 10 times a month. So we can request Planet. We say, next time you have a flyover this place in the world, take a picture of it and send it to us. And that just completely changed the way we worked, because now we don't have, now we have like that capability, which every time I talk about it, I get really excited because 20 years ago, you'd have to be like in the CIA. It's a bit expensive. It's a couple $1,000s a month. So now we have a couple of tools that we can afford to pay. That's probably the one that we use the most. And then the other development has been that we now have a data science team. And one of the things that they do is they create custom tools. And all of the programs that they make are open source. So they're all on GitHub. And we also invite people to submit program ideas or to submit, programs that could be used for the community. And we sort of highlight them. It's for everybody. It's a difference between saying, I can never know the answer to these questions, and I can know the answer to these questions. So it's either you go, oh no, forget it. We're never going to know about this. To no, actually, we can know about this. We can answer every question that we have, right? So I'll give you like a really good example of that is the MH17 investigation. That's the sort of the early Bellingcat investigations that it has to do with this plane MH17 that got shot down over eastern Ukraine in 2014. And when the plane crashed, nobody knew what happened because it was like over a war zone. The plane just like, showed up, kind of crashed on a field. Nobody knew what had happened, right? And so, that's 298 people who died. And yeah, it's like, what happened? Nobody knows. We don't know, right? Now, normally, before the internet, it might have been that you never would have known. Like, you had to have been there to know what happened, right? But what my colleagues at Bellingcat were able to do was use images that Russian soldiers had taken themselves, like selfies that they had taken over the course of many weeks, to track an anti-aircraft missile system that had traveled into Ukraine from Russia in the weeks prior. And that anti-aircraft missile system was the one that was used to shoot down MH17. And there's like dozens of articles that Bellingcat researchers have written, since 2014 that like build up that case. I'm like condensing years of research into like a sentence. It was a Russian anti-aircraft system that did this, but that was done entirely with like selfies that Russian soldiers were taking of themselves and posting on social media and Google Earth Pro. Because if I take a selfie, right, like with you imagine like a group of 18-year-old Russian guys are taking a selfie. They got a missile system here. In the background, there's some buildings, there's a tree, right? And you go, okay, where is that, right? Because not all the time, they're not always saying like, hey, we took this at the intersection of X and Y, right? So then that's why. So when you see a picture like that, right? Like imagine you're looking at a picture and you go, wow, I think that might be I wonder where that picture was taken. Because if that could be the system, we can figure out where that picture was taken. Maybe it was taken close to where the airplane was shot down. Maybe we can determine. And so again, at that moment, there's two options. Like we can either find out where the picture was taken and maybe build this case, or we can just walk away and say, we'll never know. So that's why we're using those tools, because they let us answer questions that we have about what's happening in the world. So the thing that we don't work with, and that does worry me, is anything that's like kind of mass surveillance, like at this in the sense of like Clearview AI. I don't know if you've ever heard about them, or Palantir. Like these are companies that create software that can help anybody, track a person, right? Like you give them a name and it will pull every single little footprint that they have on the internet. And that could be really useful for us. We don't use those ones just because we're uneasy with that idea that like this is like the clients for these programs are like the NYPD, the government of Venezuela, and Bellingcat. So we're like we're not comfortable with that. So yeah, I do have like issues with technology. Obviously, I always talk about how there's stuff that's amazing from a researcher perspective. Like, wow, this is such a gold mine. I'm glad this exists. But then on the other side is like, but as a human being who lives in the year 2024, this is terrible. Like, what a horrible dystopian future we live in. It's often the same, like the opposite sides of the same coin. We do everything what we call by hand, which is the old-fashioned way, which is the eye. So we look at an image and we're just really looking at it and we're analyzing it in that way. We're talking about it. We're saying, hey, I noticed that there's a kind of a tree back there. I wonder what kind of tree that is. It looks like it could be a pine tree or some, stuff like that, right? Or somebody will say, oh, there's something in the background there. I wonder if it's like graffiti. If it's graffiti, we might be able to see it on Street View, on Google Street View, right? So we're doing it by hand. It's a very involved process because, again, you're looking at a picture. And if I show you a picture and I say, where was this taken? You have to, yeah, look at it for a long time and start theorizing and say, well, the buildings look kind of European. So I'm thinking maybe somewhere in Europe, right? We do training classes for human rights lawyers and journalists and stuff. We teach them how to do this kind of stuff. So I've been doing this for a long time, and universally in every class that we teach, if you have somebody come in who has no experience with image analysis, and that process that I'm describing, we call that geolocation when you determine where an image is taken. It's amazing because people their first reaction is that it's impossible. But if you really sit down and think about it, just give it a shot, it's not impossible. You can do it, right? So if I show you a picture from like my Google Photos right now, you'll look at it and you go, that could be anywhere on planet Earth. Like I know you took it on this planet because you can't go anywhere else. So it can only be there, right? And a lot of people would give up and they'll go, well, forget it, right? Like I'm not going to guess. But if you sit down and you look at it and you start kind of eliminating places, suddenly you have a theory for where it might be. If it's around here, then maybe Google will tell me, right? And so you go from a theory to knowing that there are tools out there that you can use to check. And so you're testing theories. And sometimes it takes you 10 minutes, sometimes it takes you an hour, sometimes it takes you 6 months, but you can discover where, there's obviously limitations, but a lot of times you can discover where an image was taken, right? So that is all done by eye. It's theorizing. It's saying maybe it's this. I think it might be there. That building, I think, has some Korean language on it, so maybe it's in Korea. It's all by hand. So most of us are not journalists. I'm not a journalist. Most of my colleagues are not journalists, but at the same time, we do journalism, right? A lot, I would say. We do a lot of stuff that's not journalism, but I think people know Bellingcat mostly for the journalism. And so we've often asked ourselves, like, what are we? What are we doing, right? We had a staff retreat a couple years ago, and we had a really heated discussion. There's about 35 of us who work here. And what we said, for sure, we're not activists. Like, we're not like WikiLeaks. We're not like Human Rights Watch or Amnesty International. Like, we're not out here, trying to call attention to an issue because we want to mobilize civil society, on this issue. That's not what we're trying to do. I would say that we are just trying to answer the question, like, what happened? Like, what is the truth of this matter? Who shot down, or what happened to MH17? MH17 was shot down. Who poisoned Alexei Navalny? It was these 5 guys from the FSB in Russia, right? Where did this massacre took place? It took place precisely here, in this place in Ethiopia. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to answer questions about things that are happening in the world to which there are no immediate answers, but with a little bit of elbow grease on the open source methodology, maybe we can get to the answers. So that's what I would say. We're just trying to answer questions. Now, sometimes a question is this video fake, right? Or is this image that the Ministry of Defense is publishing accurate, right? So sometimes that's the question. We can call that debunking or fact checking more generally, but it's not necessarily that. It's more like we're just looking for answers about what's happening.
Mobilizing Data for Justice is a podcast by the Data Justice Hub at Concordia University and the University of Winnipeg, in partnership with Harbinger Media and with funding from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. Production by Elena Rowan, an interview by Chris Hurl and Kevin Walby. From the Data Justice Hub, the Mobilizing Data for Justice team is me, Elena Rowan, Chris Hurl, Marius Seneville, and Kevin Walby.